next speaker today is Emmy Riley from Cyclone, and she is lassoing a topic hotter than a branding iron. It's nuclear energy. Emmy is the Energy and Engineering Team Leader, Account Manager at Cyclone, and she was recently awarded Consulting and Specifying Engineering Magazine's 40 Under 40. This is her sixth time presenting at the Rodeo, and backed by popular demand, Emmy is going to be presenting in a Pecha Kucha style. So buckle up. Please give her a warm welcome. Thanks, Emmy.
Thanks, guys. Thanks. All right. Well, today I'll be talking about can we get to net zero without nuclear? And in case you're not familiar with the Pecha Kucha style, it's 20 slides, 20 seconds a slide, so it goes pretty quickly, and I hope I don't let you down. All right, so the reason I wanted to learn more about this topic is that I'm personally a nuclear proponent, and that can be kind of taboo in this industry. So I was curious about what the numbers looked like for the future of nuclear as we try to achieve net zero. The reason we care about achieving net zero is because we're trying to avoid going above 1.5 degrees global average temperature to avoid encountering the worst effects of climate change, and estimates right now are that that's going to happen in the next 10 years or so if nothing changes. So one of the big benefits of nuclear for this is that it produces no carbon dioxide when it's producing electricity. And it's also a nice complement to renewables, which will be a big part of net zero because it has flexible, scalable, and a continuous power supply that can be scaled up really quickly. Right now in the world, nuclear provides about 10% of the world's power supply, and it's about 1/3 of the world's carbon-free power supply. In the US, that's a little bit higher. We're at about 20%, and we have been for around the last 20 years or so. The IEA says that, who I would consider the gold standard of energy data and forecasting, considers nuclear to be an indispensable part of a cost-effective path to net zero, and they estimate that we need to about double the amount of nuclear that we have to achieve that goal. We're going to dip our toes into a little bit of technical for a second. So the way that a fossil fuel power plant works is they burn fossil fuels to boil water, that makes steam and drives a steam turbine that makes electricity. And the stuff on the left, the burning of fossil fuels, is what emits greenhouse gases. Pretty similarly, a nuclear power plant also is boiling water to make steam to drive a turbine to make electricity, but they're instead using nuclear fission to create that heat. And like I said earlier, when you're making heat through fission, there is no greenhouse gas emissions. And so at a really high level, the way that nuclear fission works is we are splitting atoms to release energy. And when you release that energy, that releases heat, and you're boiling water to make the steam. That's all happening in fuel pellets that contain an isotope of uranium, and there's like millions of them in a nuclear reactor. Nuclear sounds so great, so what's holding it back? One issue is spent fuel storage. It has a long half-life. Right now, what we do in the US is mostly store them in dry casks on concrete pads, but actually something I learned in making this presentation is that you could put all of our US spent fuel on one football field at a depth of less than a yard. Another thing holding it back is operational safety, or at least the public's perception of it, but actually something I learned in making this is that it's on par in terms of this really cryptic metric of deaths per unit of energy. It's on par with wind and solar, and there have only been 3 major accidents in its whole history. Some nations because of operational safety primarily, have decided to divest from nuclear. Germany is one of those, and they just shuttered their last 3 power plants this year. Typically when that happens, their grid gets dirtier and it's harder to achieve net zero goals. Other countries, however, like the UK and France and China, in their climate goals, they've actually increased nuclear as part of their power gen mix, and still others like South Korea, who had initially rolled back nuclear, have re-upped it and said that they want it as part of their climate action plan power mix. The biggest by far reason that nuclear is being held back is because it's so expensive to build. Per unit of energy, it's higher than any other fuel source. It costs about $5 to $10 billion to build a traditional US plant. One that you might have heard of is the Vogtle Unit 3 plant in Georgia. It came online this summer at the end of July, 6 years late and $16 billion over budget. But on the positive side, it will provide clean energy for 60 to 80 years to the citizens of Georgia and the rest of the people on that grid. So how can we make it make sense? The way that I read over and over is that we need to standardize the designs. We need them to be able to be made in factories, on assembly lines, get them out, make it repeatable so that they aren't custom made on site and get bogged down in change orders and things like that. One company that's doing that is TerraPower, which I would call Bill Gates's reactor. It's a smaller reactor, and their goal is to have their first demonstration reactor operational by 2028 in Wyoming. It's being half funded by government and half funded by TerraPower. And as you would expect, they have raised a ton of money for it. Even smaller reactors, still called small module reactors, they're typically advanced reactors, and they have broad political and institutional support. They receive big grant funds in the US right now, and they have increasing support in other places like the UK, Canada, and France. There are a number of startups in these places, and they have brought on execs from other startups, like tech startups like SpaceX, to implement agile, iterative project management techniques so that they're able to drive down the costs of producing the reactors. We're near the end here, so I wanted to circle back to that IEA, sorry, it's written wrong, net zero emissions 2050 scenario, where it said that by 2050 in their climate action plan, we need to about double the amount of nuclear that is producing energy. They also had a low nuclear case, and in that case, I think this is the point, is that if we were to not extend the lives of our existing plants and invest in newer tech, it would cost $500 billion more in investment, and it would raise consumer prices by $20 billion per year through 2050. So can we achieve net zero without nuclear? The answer is yes, but it'll be harder and cost more. And I found this quote in one of the articles I read that said, decarbonizing the economy, the global economy, is far too vast a problem to exclude any solutions. And I think that it couldn't be better said. That's my time. Save nuclear.
All right, thanks, Emmy. Don't go anywhere. Oh, yep. Too close. All right. Well, who's got questions for Emmy? Don't run away.
Drop mic. Yeah.
John, yes.
John does.
Benny's coming.
I got the mic for you.
A couple of questions. First up, how do you address the issue of the water used by nuclear? I'm assuming all these new technologies, as well as existing, we know use a lot of water for cooling.
Right.
And that water is actually 4 times more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide is. The question is, how much does that come out in rain right away versus go up into the stratosphere and add to global warming? So I think we need to look at these issues on a global, both local and global scale, to really see, do we want to invest that much more in the local nuclear plant versus the one 93 million miles away?
Right.
And so I think it's worth looking at those issues in more depth.
For sure, yeah. And I would say, like, before I answer any questions, I want to preface this by saying that this was 6 minutes and 40 seconds, and you could do an hour on any one single slide that was in this deck. I think what you were saying at the beginning about the water, so the new, like the SMRs, some of them do, like there's one called New Scale, and it does use water, but I think it might be like a heavy water reactor that rather than a light water. And then other ones use like molten salt, other sodiums as their coolant. So it isn't like a water-based coolant system. Okay. I mean, definitely. Like we said, there's safety risks, operational safety risks. I don't have information on every single reactor on its cooling and moderating systems at the tip of my fingers. But certainly there are safety risks. But again, like everything over and over said that the biggest risk, I mean, the biggest risk for all of us is probably climate change, and that this is a critical component, and the biggest drawback or the biggest hurdle it'll have to get over is the cost issue.
Great.
Any other questions?
Yeah. Mickey.
Is it true that Bill Gates's Is it true that Bill Gates's reactor is so small that it can fit in a chip that can fit in our brains?
That's probably his end goal. That's probably been his long game. Yes. But it is small. It wasn't one of those small module reactors. His was just over 300 megawatts, and that one had, it's like they're building it flexibly, modularly, so that if they want to up it to 500, they are able to do that. And I thought there was really good information, and he's done like 1 million interviews about this that are great to watch. Right now it's really expensive. It's on par with that $5,000 per kilowatt. That is what would be typical of a traditional US reactor. But their goal is to drive that down to more like 2,000, which would be in the range of like what France or South Korea is doing, where nuclear seems to be a lot easier. I mean, like had been easier for France to do, but you guys selling it to Germany. Yes.
Last question.
Why is it cheaper in France? What are they doing differently?
Yeah, so they, one of the big reasons is that, so like in France and in South Korea, they have one utility building them, and they have one regulating body regulating them. And so what drives up the cost in the US a lot is that we have these bespoke sites, so every single site is a different utility, a different reactor type. And different laws are going into them, and they can be enacted mid-construction, and so it just makes these costs balloon. And in places like France and South Korea, they have just like more regulatory control.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for the questions. Thank you, Emmy. Before you run away again, we have...
Sorry. Oh my God. Yes.
Your first rodeo for your over 5 presentations.
It ain't at all. Thank you.
Yes, thank you all so much. All right. Well, there's a herd of buffalo blocking our path, so I guess we have to take a break. So